Men love their native land, though some realize that they do, others could not tell you why, and others, again, are too shy to talk much about it. But the typical Frenchman knows that he loves France, he knows why, and he is not afraid to say it quite frankly. And, indeed, it is not difficult to understand his proud love for a country that is such a fair and kindly mother to her children, who gives them with both hands all the good things that the earth can give. Poets who were not French men have written tenderly of France, the pleasant land of France, immortal and indomitable France. The French man has only to think, or speak, of la patrie, and all the glories of French history, French literature and art, and the varied beauties of the French countryside, rise up before him. And what a wonderful patrie is his, like a great book full of the loveliest coloured pictures whose pages you turn with delight as you pass from Normandy to Brittany, from Brittany to Paris, and from Paris down to the valley of the Loire, or to the Rhône and Provence. The traveller from the east, and, occasionally, the traveller from the west, will disembark at Marseilles, which was a Phoenician seaport long before the Greeks and Romans anchored their galleys there, but it is better to begin at the top of the map and work our way down from the English Channel, La Manche, the Sleeve, it is called in French, to the azure coast of the Mediterranean. The first impression of the visitor who lands at Dieppe will probably be one of mild surprise at the way in which the train wanders through the cobbled streets as if it were a mere tame tram. Then he will notice that those streets are edged with high houses, white or pale pink, whose long narrow windows are flanked by slated wooden shutters called persiennes. These shutters are a characteristic feature of the typical French house in every part of the country, just as the jutting, rounded sentinels at the angles of the walls are characteristic of the French baronial castle. Normandy is a land of orchards, of chalk cliffs dividing to let the curly Seine pursue its zigzag journey to the sea, of gnarled grey castles, and abbeys, and cathedrals almost as closely interknit with English history as with the history of France. It is a green and kindly land, and must have seemed a haven of many delights to those sea-scarred Norse pirates who landed there in the 9th century, abandoned their dragon-prowed ships, and settled down to build castles and walled towns, and to defy the French barons who vainly tried to drive them back into the sea whence they came. Their descendants are the Normans of today, and by their sunny fair hair and their keen blue eyes many of them prove their blood kinship with the Scandinavians with whom they now have nothing else in common. The modern Normans are said to be, as the Scotch are said to be, a grasping people. Certainly a Norman farmer is a good hand at a hard bargain. But they are a fine, sturdy folk, and they make the most delicious cider. The peasant dress is less striking than that worn in Brittany and in the south, but it is pleasant to see the old dames coming in from the villages to towns like Rouen to sell their butter and vegetables and cheese in the fresh dewy hours of the morning, with snowy white bonnets framing their sunburnt faces, and brightly coloured shawls folded neatly round their shoulders, and ample aprons of blue or blue and white print. All over France workmen of all kinds wear the blue cotton blouse and the peaked casquette that are such a sensible and simple working dress, and so much more agreeable to the eye than the dingy, nondescript tweeds affected by the English. During the centuries that a Norman dynasty reigned over England, the history of the two countries was almost one. The conqueror died at Rouen and was buried at Caen. Coeur de Lion, the most valiant and the best loved of his descendants, built a mighty fortress on the chalky cliff above the Seine near Les Andelys, and bequeathed his heart to the Cathedral of Rouen, where it was deposited in a silver casket before the high altar. It was in 1197 that Richard I began to build Château Galad. A year later the 3 outer lines of defence were finished, and the king exclaimed exultantly, "Quelle est belle, ma fille Dunnan." His 1-year-old daughter was a damsel of vast proportions, for the donjon keep, with its massive buttresses, its 4-storied tower, and its crenel-lated platform, was one of the greatest achievements of Norman military architecture. The capital of Normandy, where the Viking dukes held their court, and where the conqueror gave up the ghost after the burning of Nantes, is Rouen. Most unfortunately, the citizens of this exquisite old city were seized, some 30 years ago, by a fearful enthusiasm for modern improvements. they started making broad new streets, where trams could clank freely to and fro, and in the process they destroyed the most wonderful old houses, gabled, carved, and latticed houses, that had been the background of the many a coloured pageant of ruin history, that had seen Henry V enter the city in triumph, and Jeanne d'Arc led to execution. Still, much remains to enchant the eyes of the traveller who loves the past. He will linger beneath the Tour de la Grosse Horloge, which spans one of the narrow streets and holds an enormous clock with a richly wrought dial that has marked the passing of the minutes for more than 500 years. He will find it hard to tear himself away from the glorious cathedral, with its soaring spires, its glimmering, jewelled windows, its many monuments to long-dead princes and cardinals. Over the tomb of each cardinal, but high up, so that it is not very easily seen, hangs the red hat which marked his illustrious rank during his lifetime. The hats of the more recent have still a rich reddish tinge, but those that have swung aloft there for a certain number of years wax wan and pale, and finally become a sort of dull parchment colour, while their long tassels look like tufts of grey cobweb. Puissant dukes and lordly churchmen have dwelt in the fair, green land of Normandy, but in the little town of Yvetot, nestling among the orchards where the queerly clean white pigs pursue the fallen apples, there was for many centuries a man who could claim the title of king, the King of Yvetot. These kings were said to be the descendants of a certain Gautier, chamberlain to Clos I of France, by whom Hemy Wessel slain in ill fit of anger, and whose domain the sovereign afterward, as an act of penitence, elevated into a kingdom. Yvetot remained exempt from military service all through the feudal period, when other Norman towns had to send each its quota of fighting men to serve its liegelord in the field. As late as the 18th century, there was a stout fellow who called himself Roi d'Yvetot, but when His Majesty was unwise enough to pay a visit, with his queen, to their brother a monarch in Paris, they were overwhelmed by the burlesque homage paid to them by the mocking courtiers of the real king, and were glad to return to their pocket-handkerchief kingdom among the apple trees. Very few Londoners who see the words Tooting Bec on an omnibus, or who go where that omnibus will take them and get out at Tooting Bec Common, have any idea that the place is so called because it belonged in the olden days to the Abbey of Bec in Normandy. Yet so it was. And Bec has another link with English history, for it was there that a young lawyer, Lanfranc by name, assumed the monkish cowl in 1042, a cowl which was transformed into the mitre of the Archbishop of Canterbury 28 years later. Lanfranc's motive for becoming a monk was curious. He had been seized, robbed, and bound to a tree by a band of robbers in the forest between Avranches and Rouen, and during the night, which he spent in solitude, he tried to while away the hours by repeating the psalms and prayers, which formed the accepted worship of the season, and found that not one remained in his memory. Then a great change of spirit came over him. He shed tears to think of how he had neglected holy things in order to pursue the unprofitable study of the law, and resolved that whenever he was released from his plight, he would make up for lost time. When he entered the then poor and humble monastery in the wooded valley of the Bec, he can little have dreamed that he was taking the first step on the road which would lead him to an archbishop's throne. Westward of Normandy lies a region fully as fascinating, but very different, the land of Brittany, known to Chaucer as Armoric Bretagne, and to yet more remote writers as Armorica. This most ancient name is formed of two Celtic words, ar, upon, and mori, the sea. It was to distinguish England and Wales, and, after the union of the crowns in 1603, Scotland, from this other Bretagne that the adjective great was placed before Britain. The people belong to the same race as the Welsh, and have cousins among the Irish and the Scots. They are a mysterious people, whose origin, both in time and place, is so enveloped in darkness that even the wisest scholars cannot come to an agreement about it. They were certainly blood brethren of the early Britons, and their priests were Druids, like theirs, and their mode of worship, their temples, and their tombs, were the same. Here and there in the southwestern counties of England you will find circles of stones, like Stonehenge, or groups of stones, like those at Lannion in Cornwall, which show that the Celts lived and died there. But in Brittany you find not far scattered fragments, but whole avenues and aisles of such monuments. At Tregestelle, for example, the silvery sands are studded with huge blocks of ruddy tawny rock, set up no one can tell how many thousands of years ago by the forebears of the Bretons of today. And at Carnac, westward of Ory, where stands a miraculous well sacred to Saint Anne, there is a perfect forest of these gaunt, mysterious stones, rising from the windswept plain where grows that variety of stunted, aromatic heather which we in England called Cornish heather. The names of many rivers and hills all over Western Europe show how far afield the men who wrought these huge stones must have wandered in the dusk before the dawn of history. A font was their word for a river, and so we have the Avon, the Afton, the Aisne, the Vienne, the Punjab, 5 rivers, and the *Donau, Danube. Penbob Bennett was what they called a hill, so we have *Ben Nevis, Penzance, the Apennines, and the Pindus. The chikar of a Breton bride and bridegroom Carnac is the same as the chikar of Carmarthen, and is the Celtic for a stronghold. The Bretons have forgotten their pre-Christian mythology, and reck as little of Arthur and Merlin as of Darius and Lao Tzu, but they are still great lovers of legendary lore. The stones at Carnac, they say, were pagan soldiers who pursued good St. Cornel, and were by him changed into their present craggy form. The loneliness of their country, its nearness to the sea, its grey stretches of marsh and its strange, misty, luminous skies, seem to have given a tinge of poetical melancholy to the Breton mind. Their music is wistful and sad. Some of their chants are probably far-off echoes of druidical hymns, and the cadences of many have an odd resemblance to the songs sung, or played on the bagpipes, by the Highlanders of Scotland. Indeed, the Bretons have a sort of bagpipe of their own, called the biniou. Very wisely, they have resisted the temptation to abandon their characteristic dress, which has altered hardly at all since the 15th century. Those butterfly headdresses with vast white wings of stiffened muslin which in England are seen only depicted on ancient tombstones, and monumental brasses are seen in Brittany on the heads of the Bretons. The men, too, have stuck to their loose knee breeches, their short, thick gaiters, their black jackets sewn with rows of bright buttons. On their heads they may wear a broad hat with a shallow, rounded crown, or a sort of toque with a flap behind, or a fisherman's cap of red or dark blue wool. Here and there in the Breton villages you will meet a smart young tar, in the charming uniform of the French Navy, with a cheery scarlet pom-pom on the top of his cap. There are many Bretons in the naval forces of France, and they bring back quaint objects from Cochin China and Senegal to decorate their homes, those rather sombre homes whose inner walls are of rough granite, and whose bedrooms are often beds like the shelves of a cupboard sunk deep into the kitchen wall and closed, like a cupboard, with oaken doors. You see the same odd arrangement in Holland and in Scotland. Overhead hang branches of sweet herbs, and, perhaps, leathery-looking, dusky brown hams. And always, on a little bracket, there is a coloured image of the Virgin Mary, in glazed pottery or painted plaster. The people are, on the whole, taller than their kinsfolk the Welsh, they are dark more often than fair, and the faces of the men have the high cheekbones and well-hewn chins characteristic of a certain type of Scot. Farming is a thankless task on these salt marshes, with their wiry grass and rough heather. Most of the Bretons are fishermen, and leave to the women and children the care of the flocks and herds that find good enough grazing where neither corn nor barley will thrive. Many of these fishermen spend the whole summer on the fishing banks off Iceland, where cod abound, and where sometimes they are kept busy for hours at a stretch hauling in the huge, flapping white fish by the weird light of the sun that never sinks below the horizon line. The coming of winter means that the fleet of fishing boats must return to port, with their cargoes of gutted and salted cod. Some, alas, do not return, and for them tablets are set up in the wind-battered Breton churches, asking prayers for the soul of some brave Lormec, Guillaume, or Fantec, Francois, drowned off the coast of Iceland, or, simply, lost at sea. For those who do return a special pardon, which in Brittany means something between a fair, a pilgrimage, and a procession, is held on the 8th of December, the day sacred to Our Lady of Good Tidings, the patroness of fisherfolk. Above the grey granite cottages all the bells of the village rejoice, from the windows hang white sheets stuck all over with sturdy ivy and cheerful holly. The girls wear their prettiest white caps, some like butterflies, some like nautilus shells, and their finest trinkets of iron, set with the jewels of coloured glass. Some of them are already engaged to be married, and are thanking Our Lady of Good Tidings for the safe return of their fiancés from the cruel, mysterious seas of the unsetting sun. Others are hoping that when the next pardon comes round they may have the same cause for thankfulness. Were an angel to descend from heaven, says a Breton writer, he would alight first upon the Crezica at St. Paul, Delaware, Lyon. This might be rather difficult, even for an angel, since the Crezica is a lofty and sharply pointed spire. The Bretons declare that the word means the Devil's Tower, and of course there is a legend about it. When the church to which the tower belongs was being built, Old Nick, or Vieux Guillaume, as they call him there, decided that he himself would take charge of the job, and complete it in his own honour. So he reared this beautiful spire, with its delicate pinnacles and its slender, fluted windows. Then, just as he was fixing the golden weathercock on the summit, St. Paul, the patron saint of the town, appeared, to the consternation of Vieux Guillaume, sprinkled the spire with holy water, and dedicated it solemnly to God. This saint has a glorious cathedral all to himself in the town that is called after him. Yet he was no Breton, but a Briton. Paulus Aurelian was his very Roman-sounding name, but he was born in England, and it was as a missionary that he came to Armorica, or say in the year 530, 66 years before St. Augustine brought the gospel of Christ to Kent. St. Paul loved his fellow men well, and strove earnestly for their good, but better still did he love the little birds. Tilda in this way he reminds us of St. Francis, whom we shall meet later at Assisi. Now Street Paul was grieved when he heard that flocks of his feathered friends were plundering the fields and orchards of his master, St. Hydaltus. So he went forth and called to the culprits that they must follow him whithersoever he led them. They obeyed, and found themselves inside the monastery walls and in the presence of St. Hydaltus himself. The elder saint rebuked them gently. A Breton vendor or images lof their greed at Anduisize given them his blessing. The younger saint bade them fly away again, which they must have been very glad to do. And, of course, the fields and orchards of St. Hydaltus were ravaged no more. St. Paul had remarkable powers over minerals as well as over animals. It is said that when he wished to check the encroachments of the sea at a certain point on the Breton coast where his sister, a nun, dealt in a convent, he simply put a row of little pebbles along the beach, and the pebbles promptly grew into great big rocks, and the sea took the hint and advanced no farther. And he knew how to manage larger and more alarming creatures than birds. Once he led a dragon captive, using his stole as a leash. You can see the very stole, a strip of Byzantine embroidery wrought long ago by Greek hands on the shores of the Sea of Marmora, in the little Breton church of Enesbaz to this day. Though the charm of Paris is quite French, the traveller would make a great mistake who judged France and the French from Paris and the Parisians. Beyond the capital, with its gay sparkle and stir, lies the vast, quiet countryside, where the unwearying cultivators till the bountiful fields, and where communities of simple, home-loving, industrious people live in placid towns and villages that seem to have been fast asleep for at least 100 years. To English eyes the typical French farmhouse may seem to rub shoulders a little too closely with the cowshed and the pigsty, but if you step inside, you will see that the red-paved kitchen is spotlessly clean, and if you should be invited to share a meal with even the simplest family, you will marvel at the natural skill in cooking which all French women appear to possess. It is true that only in the large towns can you get a really good cup of tea. But who wants tea in a land where the coffee is something to dream about, and where the delicious bread that goes with it is rolled into narrow, crinkly loaves more than a yard long? The typical Parisian, like the typical Cockney, is, and knows himself to be much quicker-witted than his country cousins. And many amusing stories are told in French books about the French Gavroche, the little street sparrow, who will play all sorts of clever pranks to win a couple of sous. But he is great-hearted, too, and a French poet has said of him, he and his elders, the poor of Paris, are very like those ancient Gauls of whom the Romans wrote that they loved wordy battles, quips and arguments. The people of Normandy and Auvergne, on the other hand, are inclined to be silent and slow. The charm of Paris is not easy to describe, for is it easy to forget? Perhaps it lies partly in the vivid and intense movement and color of her everyday life, the beauty of her open spaces, her fine bridges, statues, palaces, and parks. Her sky and her river have enchantments of their own. Nothing anywhere else is quite the same. When Julius Caesar conquered Gaul, he found, where the Cathedral of Notre Dame now stands, a strip of muddy island which he proceeded to fortify, and which bore for a time the name, Julii Civitas, the town, or stronghold of Julius. Its other name, Lutea, came from the abundant clay, Jutum, found in the vicinity. In spite of the mud, the Romans made it a military center, built a temple to Jupiter, and, in the early years of the Christian era, chose it as their imperial winter quarters in Gaul. The open space still called the Champ de Mars was a drill ground for the legionaries. It was here that the soldiers of Julian the Apostate, nephew of Constantine the Great, proclaimed him emperor. And here, on the spot where paganism had seemed to triumph in the person of the anti-Christian Julian, a Christian church was dedicated to St. Stephen in the year 375, only 12 years after the emperor's death on the spear of a Persian cavalryman near Ctesiphon. From that small ridge of mud rising above the waters of the Seine grew the great city which we see today, with its beautiful gardens and fountains and statues, its wonderful shops, famous especially for ladies' dresses and children's toys, its bridges bearing the initial N to show by whom they were built, its domes and spires and squares, and its fringe of woods to the west. The Cathedral of Notre Dame has had much to suffer at the hands of the people of Paris. Sometimes in a deluded anxiety to improve the ancient edifice, sometimes in a mad desire to desecrate or destroy it, those people have at various times dealt cruelly with the most precious of all their possessions. In 1771 the western porch was smashed up, to give a more free scope for royal processions. When the Revolution was at its height, the images of saints were smashed, statues of the cynic Voltaire and the head in air Rousseau placed in their niches, an opera dancer wearing the red cap of liberty was enthroned on the high altar, there to be worshipped as the goddess of reason by a roaring mob of revolutionaries. 2 other dangers has the cathedral escaped. In 1871, during the tumults which followed the German victory in the Franco-Prussian War, an effort was made to set Notre Dame on fire, but luckily the medical students of the Hetel-Dieu Hospital arrived in the nick of time and quenched the flames. Lastly, the roof was scarred by a German bomb during the Great War. Now the stone demons on the topmost towers grin down upon a peaceful Paris, and let us hope nobody will ever try to harm their splendid dwelling again. They enjoy a really delightful view, those stone demons. They can see the sweeping curves of the Seine, the spires and domes and treetops of Paris, and, if their carven eyes are keen enough, the anglers sitting patiently on the quays, the fierce little taxis hurtling madly through the streets, the bare-legged schoolboys in dark overalls and peaked caps scampering to and from the lycée where they have such hard lessons to learn. For some time before the war, and ever since, the French people have shown an increasing interest in sport. We all know the record of that fine boxer Georges Carpentier, and how Mademoiselle Lenglen, and Monsieur Barotra, and other French tennis players, distinguished themselves at Wimbledon. And yet it is not very many years since the only recreation permitted to the boarders in the French lycées was to stroll in the playground and chat to each other. All that is changed now. If the carven demons on the top of Notre Dame can see as far as the Champs-Élysées, they will see moving patches of gay color gather and disperse at certain points there at certain times of year, but unless somebody goes up and explains to them that these moving patches are football blazers, I do not see how the poor demons can possibly understand what is happening. How many stirring and thrilling events have happened in the vast cathedral below, while the stone demons grinned and scowled above. There, while the blue, pungent smoke of the incense climbed to the interlocking arches, St. Louis received his pilgrim's staff ere he set sail for the Holy Land. There the baby King Henry VI was crowned King of France. There a very different sort of monarch, the bluff and breezy Henri of Navarre, proclaimed his change of faith by publicly attending Mass. There Napoleon, robed in dark red velvet sprinkled with golden bees, took the imperial diadem from the hands of the startled Pope and himself placed it upon his brows. Napoleon's crown is in the museum of the Louvre, but in the treasury of Notre Dame there is another crown, not of gold or silver, but of grey and prickly fibers, which is regarded by millions of people with very different feelings. According to an ancient tradition, this is the crown of thorns. It was given to St. Louis by the Emperor of Constantinople, and when the saintly king returned to France he built, in order to hold the relic, the lovely little St. Chapel, which still stands on the Fle de la site, not far from Notre Dame, though it no longer fulfills the purpose of its founder. If, when you have blinked at the jeweled brightness of its windows, you leave the St. Chapel and cross the Pont Neuf, which has not been Neuf since the year 1578, a little walk will bring you to the Louvre, once a royal palace, the scene of many grim and gorgeous episodes in French history, and now one of the most marvelous picture galleries in the whole world. The treasures of the Louvre are so numerous, we must not pause to do more than glance at some of the best known. Among these are Leonardo da Vinci's Mona Lisa, that mysteriously smiling dark lady with mocking lips and beautiful folded hands, Titian's hand to some disdainful young man with a glove, Raphael's brightly coloured Belle Jardinière, and Madame Virgile Lebrun's charming portrait of herself and her small daughter. Of the statues two stand out, unforgettable, the Nike, the winged Victory, from Samothrace, and the Venus from the island of Milos. Both statues have been grievously battered, neither has any arms, but Venus still has a head and the poor Nike has none. One statue seems to be the embodiment of triumphant energy, the other of noble repose. Paris has many museums, but none, perhaps, more interesting than the Musée Carnavalet, which is devoted entirely to objects associated with the history of Paris herself. Here you will see fragments of the Roman temple that once stood on the islet of Lutetia, and red caps of liberty worn during the Reign of Terror, and Napoleon's toothbrush, with some pink-coloured powder still on it, and the armchair in which Voltaire breathed his last. The house itself was once the home of that charming lady Madame de Sévigné, whose letters to her daughter are the most delightful ever written by any woman, in any land, at any epoch of the world's history. Whether you feel the spell of Napoleon's personality or not, you will wish to see his tomb in the Hôtel des Invalides, the old soldiers' hospital, before you leave Paris. Perhaps you may struggle a little against the spell, and try to remind yourself that, great man though he was, he did much harm, and caused much suffering. All this is true. But all this seems to fade somehow into the distance when you stand in the deep marble well under the high, shining dome of the Invalides and look at the ponderous tomb of dark, purple-red Finland granite, which holds the dust of the mighty emperor. The pillars which encircle it are upheld by statues of mournful angels in pure white marble, and between them are bronze stands, some thing-like umbrella stands, with clumps of tattered flags, the spoils of many a famous battlefield. It is my desire, Napoleon had written in his last will, that my dust should rest upon the shores of the Seine, in the midst of the French people whom I have loved so well. 19 years after his death at St. Helena that desire was fulfilled. What Hyde Park and Kensington Gardens are to the Londoner, the Champs-Élysées and the Bois de Boulogne are to the Parisian. The Avenue des Champs-Élysées was planned and planted by Marie de Médicis, the mother of Queen Henrietta Maria of England, but it was Napoleon who raised the imposing Arc de Triomphe at the western end, to celebrate the victories won by him in 1805 and 1806. After his overthrow the sculptures representing these victories were allowed to remain, but another group, emblematic of the peace of 1815, was rather oddly added to them. Somehow one does not imagine the Elysian fields of Greek legend as being, like the Elysian fields of Paris, absolutely bare of grass or turf. You will find no meadows of asphodel between the straight lines of trees planted by Queen Marie. But there is plenty of colour and movement, for this is the favourite playground of the small Parisians, and here they flit about like bright butterflies in their gaily striped and checked garments, or revolve solemnly on miniature merry-go-rounds, or watch a Punch and Judy show, sucking barley sugar the while. And the beribboned caps of their bonnes, their no-nous, as nannies are called in France, nod like poppies as they sit and chat on the iron benches, keeping one eye on the bare-legged little boys and girls in their charge. Very short frocks and very short socks were worn by these small sons and daughters of France long before the breezy and pretty fashion spread to America and thence to England and Australia, and at one time the children of other lands looked heavy and stodgy and overdraped beside these free-limbed, fleet little creatures. If you turn to the left by the Arc de Triomphe, you will be well on your way to the Bois de Boulogne, the Bois, as Parisians call it, for short. The old woods were cut down during the siege of Paris in 1870, hence the trees that grow there now are all the same age and practically all the same size. But the Bois is a perpetual delight, with its lakes and waterfalls, its fine riding road, its allées des potins, gossip walk, and its cool effects of depth and distance and greenness, so grateful to the eyes after the dust and glare of Paris. In the Quentin Durward days the Bois was part of the forest of Rouvray, and the Grand Forester was Olivier le Dame, Louis C's barber, that sly and sinister personage who hardly seemed to possess the qualities necessary for a jovial huntsman. Much more might be said about the wonders and delights of La Ville Lumière, but the castles of the Loire call us south, and the ancient towers of Provence, the land of the troubadours, lies beyond, and beyond that again the Riviera, with its groves of mimosa by the intensely blue sea, its stiff, spiky palms, its white villas climbing up the hills above the sun-steeped, mirth-loving resorts of Nice and Canon Mentone. Northeast of Paris lies the land of the great Gothic cathedrals, Amiens and Reims. This last, a marvel of beauty, with its clustering throngs of carven saints and angels, and its gorgeous stained glass, was persistently shelled during the war, and gaping holes were torn in the roof beneath which kings of France have been crowned and anointed with the sacred oil said to have been brought from heaven by a dove for the coronation of St. Louis. Amiens, though its exquisite arches were shaken by heavy shellfire, escaped more lightly. These cathedrals have an interest for Britons over and above their beauty, for they are, in form and substance, the sisters of Westminster Abbey, Lincoln and Ely and York. As we journey southward, we shall see the architecture changing, and the influence of the classical revival in the early 16th century making itself felt everywhere. Too, the Loire runs through scenery which nature and the art have joined hands to / beautify. The river itself is beautiful, the woods and hills that fringe its banks are beautiful, and each of the famous castles pipe rape ho, tape is that mark its course has some singular beauty or charm of its own. It is a literary river, for Ronsard, sweetest of French singers, was born at Vendôme and Rabelais, the bluff, genial humorist philosopher, at Chinon, near the confluence of the Loire and the Vienne. Most of the castles date from the reign of François I, when a sudden craze for building seized the great nobles of France, and most of them have elaborate mantelpieces carved with mythological characters, curving staircases with balustrades of complicated stonework, and rounded tourelles whose air of medieval fierceness is softened by the panels of Renaissance sculpture skillfully introduced into the plan. Of all the towns on the Loire, Orleans has probably most romantic interest for the British and American traveller, although little remains today of the actual houses which Jeanne d'Arc beheld when she rode into the place she had delivered from the besieging English one May day in the year 1429. The cathedral where she heard mass after the victory has been burnt and rebuilt, the greater part of the house where she lodged has been pulled down, and few of the richly ornamented, handsome old houses that still remain to testify to the ancient splendors of the town were built until her the Château de Luynes, on the Loire ashes had been scattered for 100 long years in the Seine at Rouen. But Jean is always the maid of Orleans, and Orleans will always be the city of the maid. Nor does the city forget her. In its central square it has erected a statue of her, on horseback, which is probably neither more nor less like her than any of the other imaginary portraits which have multiplied of late on both sides of the Channel. When Jean set out to deliver Orleans, her starting point was the fair city of Blois, made famous then and since by its castle, which stands on a hill where the ubiquitous Romans had a camp. The most impressive part of the building as we see it now dates from the reigns of Louis XII, who was born there, and François I, who entertained the Emperor Charles V within the older walls, and who built the astonishing staircase, upon which his device, a salamander, constantly appears and reappears. We shall now come across traces of the Romans at every turn. They built a town where Tours is now, and called it Caesarodunum. Not long after their horse-tailed helmets had vanished from the Loire Valley, the first Christian queen of France, the kind-hearted Clotilde, died. Of her is told a charming legend. Before she had succeeded in winning her husband, King Clovis, to her own faith, he was a very fierce fellow, and strongly objected to her Christian habit of charity to the poor and needy. One day he encountered Clotilde and noticed that she was holding up the skirts of her mantle, and suspected, with truth, that she was hiding some loaves of bread, intended for distribution among the beggars round the palace gate. In great wrath Clovis bade her drop her mantle, at the same time swearing dreadful oaths that if he found that she was carrying food to the poor, both she and her protégés should die on the spot. Trembling, the poor queen loosed her hold on the golden hem of her royal robe, expecting to see the loaves tumble out and to feel the sword of Clovis at her throat, when lo! A miracle occurred. Instead of the loaves, a shower of roses fell at the feet of the astonished king. If we continue our southward way, we shall have to cross the Dordogne, and we must pause in the valley of that river to peep into the caves where, not very many years ago, a little girl made a most remarkable discovery. She was the first person in modern times to explore a dark cavern running deep into the steep cliff where there had been, thousands of years ago, the home of a family of prehistoric people. When the little girl related what she had seen in the cave, and how there were pictures of huge horned beasts painted in black and red and yellow on the walls, and the bones of beasts on the floor, excited grown-ups plunged into the side of the hill, and found that she had stumbled upon one of the most rich and complete examples of a prehistoric home, with tools and weapons and the ashes of ancient hearth fires, that had yet been discovered. Further south still, and steering a little toward the east, we reach the most romantic part of France, the land of Provence, the land of the troubadours, the minstrels and poets of olden times. We meet all sorts of picturesque strangers in Provençal history, helmeted Romans, turbaned Saracens, and Frankish paladins with streaming golden beards. Across the valley of the river Gardon, not far from Avignon, the Romans threw a mighty bridge of many arches, the Pont du Gard. At Nimes they built an open-air theatre with terrace circles of stone seats. Bullfights are still held there sometimes, but pads like boxing gloves are used to muffle the bull's horns, and the aim of the toreador is to stick a little flag on the bull's head, not to stick a dart into its shoulder. The great palace of Avignon, which still looms large over the sleepy, sunny old town, was from 1308 to 1449 the home of the popes, who before and after those dates had always their headquarters at the Vatican in Rome. Those were great days for Avignon. Cardinals came down the Rhine in crimson-draped barges to hold council with His Holiness. Weavers of cloth of gold flourished, and so did the weavers of purple silk. Deep-voiced bells clanged from the people of Provence were then, and are now, very different from the people in central and northern France. They are dark-complexioned and dark-eyed, showing traces of their Saracenic origins. They love music, dance, and Provençal song, and sunburnt mirth. They love colour, and deck their mules and their donkeys with scarlet pom-poms and brass bells, and their wives and daughters with ribbons of many hues. Their language has still much in it of the ancient troubadour speech, and even those who speak French speak it with a strong Provençal accent that makes it difficult for people in other parts of France to understand them. Their land quivers and shimmers with almost perpetual sunlight. It is gay with the tinkle of bells, and sweet with the scent of pine needles, marjoram, thyme, and rosemary. The towns look like fairy tale illustrations of places inhabited by wizards and enchanted princesses, towns of clustering spires and pillared terraces and arched bridges poised airily over deep yet narrow streams. On the river Rhône, to the north of the ancient city of Arles, is a sunny little town called Tarascon, which is famous for more reasons than one. In days of old, a fearsome monster called the Tarasque is said to have lived in the vicinity and preyed upon the people, who still hold a festival every year to celebrate their deliverance from their oppressor, of whom they parade a gruesome and gigantic image through the streets. And Tarascon was the home of one of the most comical figures in French literature, Alphonse Daudet's Tartarin. This Tartarin was an ordinary, good-natured, easygoing, elderly man, inclined to be a tubby, and by no means cast in an heroic mould. But he believed, or almost believed, himself to be a perfectly terrific fellow. And somehow he contrived to make his friends share that belief and hold it almost more fervently than he. His dreams were of wild beasts and strange lands. His garden was full of outlandish plants, gourds, mangoes, cacti, palms, none of them more than a few feet in height. The walls of his house bristled with guns, swords, cutlasses, and sabres. When he strolled round to his club after dark, to have a chat or play a game of cards with one of his old cronies there, he would take a sword-stick in his right hand, a bludgeon in his left, a revolver in one pocket, a cudgel in the other, and, hidden inside his waistcoat, a Malay kris. Sometimes he had to play the oddest tricks to conceal from his friends the fact that he was as little of a hero as any law-abiding Tarasconaeus could well be. But their faith in his amazing valor was unshaken. And when a traveling menagerie halted at Tarascon, and Tartarin, boldly eyeing the lion through the bars, muttered darkly that that was a beast worth hunting, the rumor flew round the town that the fearless Tartarin had determined to go lion shooting. Tartarin was modestly confident that he could shoot a lion, a dozen lions, any number of lions. Only, and he was grateful in his heart of hearts that it should be so, only there didn't happen to be any lions in that part of the world. What a pity that the Tarasque had disappeared so many hundreds of years before. But the enthusiastic Tarasconaeus were not to be so easily put off. Since there were no lions near at hand, why should not their hero go and look for them where they were more likely to be found? Every body knows that lions abound in Africa. Let the heroic Tartarin pursue them to their native lairs. So poor Tartarin had to go, concealing his tremors with a fierce face, and staggering under the weight of his rifles and cartridges. When he reached Algiers he saw no lions about. But crawling on all fours after dusk, through a field of beetroots which he mistook for a patch of jungle, he saw a dark form vaguely looming ahead. And, of course, he wildly and hurriedly fired his rifle, only to find when dawn broke that he had killed an unfortunate donkey. Weeks passed, and Tartarin did not reappear in Tarascon. His friends began to feel anxious. And then, one fine day, his especial friend, le Commandant Bravida, received a large parcel from Algiers. And in it was a lion skin. The worthy commandant did not guess, how could he, that the lion to whom the skin had once belonged, the lion shot in Algiers by Tartarin of Tarascon, was a poor, old, tame animal, led about the country by two natives, with a tray between its jaws in which to collect small coins. Of course, Tartarin would not have done anything so unsportsmanlike as to shoot a tame lion if he had known that it was tame. But he didn't know, at the time. And so a royal welcome awaited him at Tarascon when at last he returned. The good folk there never wearied of hearing him retell the tale of his adventures, a tale in whose truth he came to believe quite as firmly as they. and the reappearance of the Tarasque itself could not have caused more excitement in the streets of Tarascon than did the arrival of the devoted camel which followed Tartarin all the way from Algiers. Southwest of Tarascon lies Carcassonne, one of the most fantastic and romantic towns in the whole of France, with its encircling, battlemented walls, its proud towers, its forest of gables and spires and quaint pointed roofs. It would not give anybody the faintest sense of surprise to see a knight in chain a mail gallop forth from the frowning gateway, while a farrier princess dangled her 40-foot-long golden locks from a turret on his right, and on his left an aged wizard in a peaked cap and a dragon-embroidered gown pelted him with scorpions and toads. According to the legend, another of those legends which contain a solid streak of fact, Carcassonne was once besieged by the Emperor Charlemagne and his paladins for many weary weeks and months, and years. The Saracens defending the town died off, a dozen at a time, as a result of famine or pestilence, or the arrows of the Franks, and yet the place held out. At last only one old Saracen woman remained alive with underscore in those stubborn walls, one old woman, the sole survivor of the garrison, and yet the place held out. For she was a stouter-hearted old dame, this Saraceness. By running from tower to tower, shooting an arrow here, flinging a javelin there, she completely deceived Charlemagne, and made him think that there were still enough men alive to hold Carcassonne against him. At last, however, one of the towers collapsed. As an act of homage to the emperor, the paladins declared, and the besiegers poured through the gap, astonished to meet with no resistance, and even more astonished when they discovered that the defense of the town had been carried on unaided for many days by that undaunted old Saracen dame. South of Carcassonne the Pyrenees roll away westward to the pass of Roncesvalles, where Roland and Oliver perished in the rearguard of Charlemagne's army, and where is still to be seen the rock which Roland cleft with his sword Durandal, while to the east lie the gorgeous blue waters of the Mediterranean and the beautiful coasts of the Riviera. As you stand among the mimosa groves and peer eastward over that lapis lazuli sea, you catch sight of a tiny speck, the rocky island of Corsica, where Napoleon was born, and where the daily life of the people is almost as simple and perilous now as it was in his time. A wild, craggy, shaggy island, where the red-capped shepherds go out to the pasture with an umbrella in one hand and a gun in the other. And you know, as you shade your eyes to see that tiny speck more clearly, that beyond, too far beyond for you to see, lie the shores of Italy.